Okay, maybe that was 3 rounds of technical difficulties that I just went through, but now I see other things showing that I'm actually live. So I'm going to start talking and I'll be checking to see whether things are actually working in the meantime. Oh goody, I see myself on my own channel. All right, I think after 3 tries I really am live now. I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I am bringing this back after a hiatus of more than a week because there is news, and also because I keep getting people saying, won't you do this live stream again? And so apparently there are people who are liking it, relying on it, passing it on, and so on. But especially I think it's important to talk about it right now because it's back in the news. Not to suggest that COVID was ever out of the news, but the news has changed its narrative. The narrative is now Europe is having a second wave. The United States maybe is having a second wave. These may be true, but let's actually look at the data and see whether my data shows that these are true. Yes, am I live? Do I have people? Started streaming 70 seconds ago. This is all looking good. Okay, here we go. So let me make sure I have this. Yes, I do. So I'll do the countries first, then I'll do the states of the United States, then the counties of California. Starting with the countries. So this is my severity graph, my attempt to combine the 2 metrics that I care about most, which are the daily cases per million, in other words, the daily cases adjusted for population, and the growth rate. You really need both of those to know whether something is a problem. Because especially if the growth rate is very high, but the daily cases is very low, it's not a problem yet. You still have very few cases. And to some degree, if the daily cases are very high, but the growth rate is low, that's less of a problem. It's a problem that you still have people getting sick and you still have people dying, plenty of problem there, but at least it's not in epidemic mode. It's a recovering problem. So the ones that we're really worried about are the ones that have both a high growth rate and a high daily cases per million. And right now, this graph is looking okay, but it's been better. We have Israel and Bahrain, which are way out there, 800, 900 daily cases per million. Recall that 200 is a hot spot, 100 is a warm spot. So these at 8 and 900 are some of the highest numbers we've ever seen for severity. Either they have a huge number of cases or they have a ridiculous growth rate. I think they actually have a large number of cases adjusted for population. And then there's everyone else. We do have, and this is just the top 20 in severity, we have a lot of warm or hot spots among the countries. You can see the list down the right in order from worst at the top to best at the bottom. Notice the United States isn't there. Notice, however, that Spain and France are there. So at a very first glance, this narrative that the United States is really bad, again, isn't true. The narrative that Europe is really bad, again, is at least somewhat true. We also have Hungary there, and the Czech Republic is a third. Let's take a look at the Czech Republic. So Czech Republic is suddenly shot up after having really a pretty good time of it. It hardly had it at all back in May and June, and then it had a few bumps, but never cracking 50, which really means it hasn't been in serious trouble. But there it is now, up at the top, near the top, at the top of the second cluster anyway. Then we have Belgium, also a European country that's showing some signs of a problem. But broadly, when I look at this picture, I don't see a clear geographic center. Bahrain and Israel are sort of Middle Easty, and we've got other ones there as well. We have some in Africa. We got Libya now, which is interesting because Libya was not, I think, a big factor. Libya down there in the medium blue, Libya was not seriously hit. But on the other hand, we don't have quite as much of the Central South America cluster, which used to dominate this graph. Costa Rica, Argentina, sure, but Brazil is gone. Brazil was one of the worst, and it's gone from the severities graph. It's not in the top 20. Ecuador. So we kind of have a kind of mixed bag. The thing that's most concerning about this graph is that about 5 of these, maybe 6, are sharply upwards, including the very worst ones, Bahrain and Israel. And so we'll look a little bit now into the daily cases per million and the growth rates to see why that is. But it does suggest that there are some growing hotspots in the world. There are some significant hotspots in the world, and they're getting worse. But the United States is not one of them, and Europe as a whole is not one of them. Let's look at daily cases per million. So if we look at Bahrain right now alone, it was back in the day when Bahrain and Qatar were the pair of really, really bad ones, the most severely hit countries by population. Bahrain was in the news a lot, in my news. No one else cared because it's small, but in terms of daily cases per million, it was one of the hottest hotspots of the world. But it seemed like it was recovering, and Qatar indeed did recover together with it. Actually, let's take a look at Bahrain and Qatar together on this graph that shows all the countries, because Qatar is no longer a hotspot. It was the worst, but it got better. It's almost a warm spot. It hasn't gotten totally better, but compared to when it was ridiculous, it's a lot better. But Bahrain has turned back around and is now one of the world's top hotspots. So that's interesting. Those two moved kind of together and then did not recover together. Qatar mostly has recovered, or is at least on its way, though it's a little disturbing that it's hanging out at 100. 100 is not good. We're going to talk about this a little bit soon, but just to remind, I tend not to even pay attention to regions, be they countries, states, or counties of California, which I also tend to focus on. I tend not to pay attention to regions that don't hit 100 daily cases per million. And if you look at, for instance, the history of the United States in this epidemic, there have been a lot of states that have gone up above 200. 200 is a hot spot. Maybe half the states have exceeded that. And even more, maybe 3/4 or more have gone above 100. We don't usually see numbers like 700. This is truly exceptional, and I think is still probably the worst example we've seen for the entire history of the epidemic is Qatar in June. But again, 100 is not that bad. If something's at 60 or 70 or 80, it's worrisome, but not a warm spot even, much less a hot spot at 200. This is my own nomenclature, but just when I look at how high things go and where they seem to really be running into problems, 100 is not it. So I mention this because let's take a look at Spain now, and France. Spain, you will recall, perhaps, along with Italy, was the epicenter to begin with. Actually, let's look at Italy even more. Spain kind of defeats my argument here. But Italy, we can see, Italy was the red alert country at the beginning of the epidemic, after China, of course. But China never got it that bad. China has never gotten it that bad, and hopefully never will. But in daily cases per million, they've always been just insignificant. I don't even know if we have data here for China, I was noticing that. We used to and we don't now, and I wonder if it's just not trustworthy or not considered trustworthy. But as far as we know, China never got it bad. And I think we knew when it had these early epidemics in Wuhan, we would get, even though there's some control of state media, of media by the state, we still would get leaks and we'd get pictures of hospitals and so on. We're not getting that anymore, at least not that I've seen. So my guess is that China really did mostly get over it, and probably without ever getting near 100 in daily cases per million. Now Italy, which again was seen as this terrible hotspot, it's somewhat shocking to me to look back. I remember a few months ago when I realized this, because I just assumed Italy had been at 500 or something. Italy never got to 100. Italy, for all that it was apparently a terrible outbreak, and they locked down. They were the first really strong lockdown, I think. They never got warm. They controlled this thing and got over it and got down to these really nice numbers of 3 and 4 in daily cases per million. Italy is seeing a slight resurgence now, but even now it's only up to 23. Now maybe you look at this and say, well, Italy really was bad, and it's just my nomenclature that's off, that 50 should be a warm spot or something. But if so, then I will just say the rest of the world has been a whole lot worse than Italy. In comparison, there have been a lot of countries that have gotten it worse than Italy, and yet relatively few countries that have had a real breakdown of their healthcare system because of it. So levels of 200, 500 even appear to be low enough that they do not melt all the hospitals, and certainly 100 does that. And so we've some of the early talk of trying to get herd immunity and to flatten the curve, there was this sense that we were all going to get infected eventually, but can we just keep it down to a level that the healthcare system can handle it? Well, it seems like so far everyone has done that. We haven't seen, maybe Ecuador or something. There have been a few breakdowns, but no one has really, like the United States, never ran out of ventilators after all, in spite of being vastly worse than Italy. Now, the United States, we can throw in here too. This graph's getting kind of heavy, but busy. But you can see the United States in its first wave never hit 100 either, but then it had a very strong wave, a fairly strong wave. Barely hit 200. You can see its wave is nothing like Qatar, but it had a fairly strong wave. It became briefly a hot spot, and then it got over it and headed downward, and is now almost a warm spot. Let's take a moment to look just at the United States. This graph is, on the big scale, is good. We saw our peak in July when all those states got it hard at the same time. And then things have been really solidly down and down and down and down. It just keeps going down. On the other hand, there is this slight flattening here. Let's look really closely at that slight flattening and see what does it really look like. So it's been heading down and down and down and down. But in recent weeks, I actually tuned into the New York Times COVID analysis, as I've mentioned. I like their graphs. It's not a political statement that I'm using their graphs. It is just that I really like their graphs. I also tune into various other media outlets, as I mentioned before, including the Washington Times, but the Washington Times doesn't have good COVID graphs. So anyway, I like this particular number the New York Times puts out continually, which is what percentage drop has the United States seen in the past 14 days. And it was glorious for a while, 20% drop, 20%, 20%. And now it's gradually been shrinking. And I've been worrying a lot over the past week as I watched that 20% become 15, then 10, then 5, then 1. Yesterday, it was shrinking by 1%. So that's flat. That's not good. That's not recovering. And the United States is still a warm spot at 115. So it is not time for it to be leveling out and for us to say, yay, we won. It can level out here. It'll be better than being way up there. But I was really hoping to see it drop to about 1/10 of this, into the range of 10 or 15, because from that place, if there is another wave upwards, it'll have a lot more time to recover, to put a lid on it before it hits a problem place. Whereas here, it's really already starting from a problem place. Again, 115, much worse than Italy ever had it. So, yes, the United States seems to be leveling off. It's not spiking by any means. It's not even heading upwards. The 14-day thing still says 1% drop over 14 days. So it's still dropping. And actually, I think I looked at it just today and saw the latest number. I wonder if I can even, I think you get to see my tabs, right? Very latest number, 3%. 3% drop. So it's gotten a little bit better in the past day, and maybe there's some sign it's heading downward. And there is a weekly cycle as well, so I've never quite figured out how that weekly cycle goes, like when is the low and when is the high, but it's normal to see some fluctuation just based on the week, the day of the week. Okay, so big picture for the United States. Let's zoom out so we can really see the big picture. It seems to be flattening its recovery. It's not recovering as quickly as it was. It has not gotten low enough for us to feel happy about it flattening out here. In fact, it's higher than it was now at its first peak. but it is a lot lower, half, a little more than half, as many cases per day as it had at its peak. So we'll keep watching that number, but that's not, that little hook there is not what we want to see. Going back to France. France with an F. We can compare it to the United States, actually. France had a peak, again, its peak when back in the day when we thought that Europe was having a wave. Looking at the France and Spain and Italy and so on, I almost say Europe never really had a first wave, not in the way that the United States did in summer. Europe's first wave was a little bit like the United States' first wave. It never even got warm, but it was still very alarming because people didn't know a lot about the virus and there was no sense of how high it would go. But Europe, like the United States, had a small wave, a wavelet in April, recovered from it, and now, perhaps like the United States, it may be heading into another big wave, or what I would almost call its first real wave, because certainly France there, that was not much of a wave. France then is definitely looking alarming. It's a warm spot, it's headed sharply upwards. This is not a good graph. That's France. And so yes, there really is something to this alarmism we're hearing around Europe right now. And then Spain, I think. Spain was hit harder, though I don't even remember that being pointed out at the time. But I wasn't doing my podcast at the time, so one of the reasons I wanted to do this live stream was because there wasn't enough focus on daily cases per million as a way of saying, if you have 1 million cases and I have 1 million cases, but we have 10 times difference of population, well, that's a completely different story. But Spain, adjusted by population, it never got hot, but it certainly got warm, solidly warm. Spain back in the day was up in the 100, 150, 160 range. So that was serious, that was significant. I would call that a real wave, for Spain at least, though not for France. But now look at Spain. Spain is a hot spot. Spain has never been a hot spot before, but now it is, just recently. And so you look at France and Spain here, there's a problem. There is a problem. I'm going to pull up Denmark and see if something's rotten there. Something is rotten in Denmark, at least a little bit. We have Denmark as well, heading into the, it's not warm, it's only at 50. It also never really had a first wave, but it also has now exceeded its first wave, just barely. Or wavelet, because it never had a first wave. Never had a big wave. None of these countries of Europe ever had a United States size wave. Let's look at the UK. I'm spending a lot of time on the countries here because things are interesting in the countries. Actually, I'm going to get rid of everyone else because it's getting too hard to see. So here's the UK. Never had a strong wave, had a small wave back in April. Again, the United States peaked above 200, so this is a third of that back then. Recovered very well, really. Under 10, again, is a solid recovery, but for reasons that I haven't even heard a theory about why this is happening now. Well, sort of, but I don't think it's clear why this is happening. But just in recent days, things are going haywire across Europe and the United Kingdom, which, by the way, is not part of Europe. So here it is up to 50. It's not warm, it's not close to warm, but it's definitely spiking. And so we're seeing this in a lot of European countries. European countries are headed in the wrong direction. Now, what's going to happen from here? Will Europe have a United States style first wave? Let's just grab a whole bunch of them. Let's see if I can do a lightning round on Turkey, of course. We always say, is it part of Europe or not? Well, I think it's not part of the UK, as I understand it. But I'm having to learn geography all over the place here. I'm not claiming to catch them all. I'm just scanning through and grabbing things that look European, names that I know. Like, Bosnia. Okay, I don't know. I don't really know where the boundary technically is on Europe, but here are some things in the range of Europe. I may even have picked something that is in no way Europe, because I don't claim to be a great scholar of geography. but I try. Oh, let's not forget the Netherlands. Ooh, Netherlands hard hit as well. Netherlands is not yet a hot spot, but is heading for warm. So here's Europe going haywire, with the exception of Bosnia, actually. Let me just do a quick refresher for myself. Exactly where Bosnia is. It may be it's sort of eastern, a little more eastern than, southeastern. Let's look at Greece while we're in that region. Greece. Okay, Greece is doing okay. Not spiking like the rest, but we do see a spike here. That most of these countries are not just rising, but spiking. We are seeing a serious spike. So, my theory, around the whole metaphorical immune system thing, is that even though Europe didn't have a strong, back in the day, wave, they probably are better prepared for this one than for that one. Though you can see it's getting more out of control than that one in many cases, like France and Czech Republic. It's worse than the first wave, but I would hope that this will be quickly contained because people know what it is, they know what to do about it, and they haven't been wearing masks in schools there, for instance, and now they're starting to again. They know the things that can be helpful. And so I think I hope, this is pure hope, but from what I've seen, these things do come in waves, and they come in waves because they suddenly spring up on you, and suddenly you realize a week after things have started to spike that they're spiking, and then everyone starts radically changing their behavior, and then they peak. So you mean they're not going to have a US type wave, but hopefully, if nothing else, we'll see the general pattern that I've been pointing out, which is that once a wave starts, about 30 days later it peaks. So this started, hard to say where it really started. Maybe you could say it really started to pick up in, or once a wave hits 100 is the way I was seeing it before. So really these things are only hitting 100 now. I don't know, it's hard to guess, but I expect we're going to see some more growth from these. It's hard to imagine these would suddenly stop growing with this kind of acceleration rate, but I think they will peter out in the next few weeks, because they usually do. All right, that's enough for countries. I've done a lot of focus on countries this time. Let's move on to the United States. But to answer the question, yes, Europe is having a wave, and it's a worse wave than the first one. All right, I didn't need to reload this, so we'll wait while it reloads. Let's see how the severities graph. This thing's going to scroll itself all over the place while it loads. I haven't spent too much time on this website lately. It still has this problem where some of the graphs are all the way to the left of the page and some of them are in the middle. I fixed that for the countries, but not for this one, so sorry. So I'm just gonna, yeah, it's still fine either way. You can still see me and you can still see the graph. Severity. Well, first of all, notice we have nothing like the countries happening here. The countries severity graph had some up in the high hundreds, like 700, 800. The worst we've got here is 270 for Tennessee. Now that's not good. It's a hot spot. It's above 200, but it's not. We're seeing nothing like the spike we see in Europe. So just at first glance, there may be something troublesome happening in the United States, but it's not as bad as Europe right now. We do see Wisconsin, I would say, spiking. We also see Utah spiking, both of them above 200 and headed rapidly upwards. No one else really. Tennessee's going upwards, so sort of, but the rest of them look roughly horizontal to me. We're not seeing a lot of recoveries. This one, Kansas, seems to be recovering. We have a little bit of recovery in Louisiana here. And these are all in the warm spot range anyway, so they're problems, but not really serious problems, not as bad as a hot spot. And among the hot spots, we see four states that are hot, and then maybe 6 states that are hot, 7 states that are hot, 13 that are warm, roughly, and then the rest are cool. So this isn't a good graph. but it's not a really alarming one. It does suggest, however, that we may not be recovering as quickly as we have been, which is not surprising. As we saw, the country as a whole has leveled out in its recovery, and it's leveled out at too high a number. It's leveled out at 115, and it needs to get to a tenth of that before I think we can really feel at all like we've truly come along to the end of a recovery. So here we are still in the United States, not doing that well, but not obviously at the beginning of another wave. This little horizontal stretch we're seeing could be a turning around and heading back upwards, but it could also just be a little flattening before we head downwards. Severity for all states. Again, not many hotspots. Those 7 we saw. A lot of states are doing okay. There are just a few: Illinois, Georgia, Vermont, Virgin Islands. I'm not sure I believe that with Georgia. Delaware, Washington, Connecticut. A lot of them are doing pretty well, under 50 there. And then some of them are doing fairly well. In Colorado, for instance, though it's headed upwards, Colorado, at that rate, the light blue line, Colorado may actually become a warm spot again, but at this point it's okay. To be at 75 is to say we're doing okay, but we've got to get lower. And Colorado is doing okay, but it's not getting lower. Let's look at California. California, at 64, it's not a warm spot, it's doing well. Let's see the whole graph. You can see just how well it's doing compared to where it was. California was in the 300s, way above hotspot territory for a brief period of about a month. And then it just got a lot better. It had this bump here, but it's gotten a lot better. California is a lot better. So behaviorally speaking, if on July 15th you came to a rational decision to go to a movie, I don't know, you can't even do that in California, to go eat outdoors at a restaurant, you can certainly do that now. If there's something that was safe then, it's absolutely safe now. It's certainly safe now. And indeed, there are probably a lot of things that weren't safe then, like eating outdoors at a restaurant, that are safer now. And we're seeing this in the orders from the government of California that are gradually relaxing some of these things. So I would say California is in a place, in a direction that it can safely think about relaxing some of its requirements. But again, 15, I want to see it at 15. 65 is okay, but 15 is where I really start to say this state's doing well. Let's look at New York. And so New York was briefly flirting with 15, down to 22 there. It, of course, had a really bad time of it back in the early times. I don't know why this graph doesn't go back to the early times, but New York was super high. And it got better, and it's gotten better and better, and it got really better, but now it's actually gradually heading back upwards. And this is probably partly the effect of other states bringing their infections to New York. We're not closing borders interstate, but or maybe New York is seeing a little bit of a wave. But anyway, this isn't alarming yet. It's not even to 50. Under 50 is really quite good, but it is rising. So New York is not getting it down into the single digits like we've seen with some regions. Looking at just a few more. Let's see some of our favorites. Texas doing rather well. Let's, can I get this? No, I can't. All right, we'll zoom it in on up to 600 so we can see the 100 line. Texas, which was really hard hit, even worse than California, is doing better like California. They really are kind of following the same path. Texas now down to under 100, though it does have this little swing back to 110, so it's too soon to say whether that's a trend. Certainly the broad trend for Texas is, the long-term trend is good and is very solidly downward. But again, even if it is really at 80 now, 80 is not good enough. 80 is not good enough. We need to get it down to the single digits really, or sometimes I say 15. And If there's a vaccine coming, which seems likely, it may be months off, and but even if it's coming next month, it would be really nice if we could keep these numbers low until the vaccine comes, because yeah, the vaccine is the thing that will really put a lid on this, I think, when it arrives and is broadly available. All right, let's look at Louisiana. Sometimes focus on that. It was off the chart, literally, and now is doing better. It dropped below 100, got a little worse, is getting a little better. Generally, it's following the path of these other ones, which is to say a massive recovery, a massive trend toward recovery, a little bit of recent wiggle that may be alarming, but the very latest wiggle is downward, the short term is upward, so who knows with Louisiana. Certainly the long-term trend is good, and Louisiana is somewhere in the low warm spot range, certainly not over it. Colorado has continued to generally do well. It seldom has cracked 100, seldom been a warm spot. It does have a little hook upwards, so should we be worried about Colorado? Well, I'm not yet. Can we get, okay, this is severity. Let's look, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit more on in total cases. So when we look at, not total cases, daily cases, if we look at these in daily cases, we see there are in DCPM, South Dakota, Tennessee, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Wisconsin are the hot spots. They're not very hot, they're in the 200s. There are quite a lot of warm spots, but squinting at this graph, I would say, certainly it's clear that things were a lot worse in July. Look at all these states that were way worse in July. Even Guam, that had its day in the sun, is now no longer a hot spot, so it's recovering. South Dakota is probably the most problematic of this group. It's high and staying high and maybe even turning back high, but short, medium term it has recovered a little bit. But generally, the wave has mostly recovered, but it didn't go down to something like what we see in May with everything under 100. It was possible, as we moved through August, that we might have seen every single state drop below 100 by now. And that has not happened. Instead, there's a stalling of the recovery. Some new states are coming on strong, states and provinces. Few of them are really continuing the recovery. Like no one in this top 20 DCPM is below 100. We haven't seen any of them. Let's look at this graph so we can see all the states and get a little bit more of a sense. Looking at this similar graph, but with all the states, we still see, broadly speaking, there's been a recovery since the peak. There are a few stragglers that I'm not super worried about from a national perspective that have had a new wave, or they're maybe having their own wave now. But we see some, I think, let's see if I can find one, like California. Yeah, well, California, of course. We see some that really are doing that. They're just recovering and staying there, which is great. But there's more of them, I think, that recovered until about the beginning of September, or even the middle of September, or maybe the second week of September, and now have sort of wiggled around there ever since. So the news is not great for the United States right now. It certainly is great compared to July. We certainly have recovered from that first wave, but we can't clearly show that recovery is being sustained. There is a possibility that we're about to turn back upwards. Now, my theory about trajectories, which I've wrote the whole Medium article about and have frequently referred to here, hypothesizes that we won't, at least not as a country. If we look at all the trajectories starting at 100, what happens is, broadly speaking, every state rises for 30 days, recovers for 40 days, and then never gets another wave. And we're still not, we still haven't seen any really solid counterexamples to that. You know, Louisiana can be explained in a couple ways, but it's certainly an outlier. South Dakota also can be explained by saying it didn't really start till here. It was hovering below, mostly around 100 the whole time. But mostly, you see all the activity of states happens in the first 30 days. They hit their peak, they recover, and then all the long tails are down below 100, with a few exceptions, which either disprove the way that, well, let's give the example of Mississippi. Is that a good one? Yeah, Mississippi. Mississippi seems to be a slight exception because it seemed like it peaked at 60 days, not at 30. But if you actually look at it, you see it just hung out here. It was random chance that it happened to hit 100. It sort of hadn't really crossed 100 until 20 days in. This is where it really began its wave. And so Mississippi's trajectory is much like all the others. So we will find out in the next month whether there are really going to be other giant new waves on the right of this graph. But so far, there haven't been, with the possible exception of Louisiana. But as I've pointed out, Louisiana also had this weird little microwave wavelet, which, though it went very high, included only New Orleans, pretty much, and was immediately squashed, and then it hovered around 100, just like whatever we were just looking at. So it is plausible, maybe I'm stretching here, to say that this is Louisiana's first wave, or at least it is rural Louisiana, certainly rural Louisiana's first wave. So the broad picture here still has me hopeful, because if it's true that once a state has had a strong wave, it never will have one again, then the United States will never have a strong wave again, and whatever we're seeing right now is just the last few that haven't had waves are finally having their waves, pushing the numbers up just a little, and then it'll all drop off again. But what we haven't seen in the United States is a real recovery. Even these long tails are still in the 50, 60, 70 range, and that's not good enough. We've got to get down into the single digits before we can really feel like we've licked this thing and can keep a lid on it with testing and contact tracing. All right, I'm certainly zooming through my time here, so I'm going to leave the states there. Again, the two questions we asked at the beginning were, is Europe having a wave now, and is the United States having a wave now? The answer for Europe seems to be yes. Anyone's guess how high it'll go. The answer for the United States seems to be not clearly, and probably not, but we'll see. Could be, but it's certainly not proven at this point that the United States is in the middle of a wave. It's probably, or it may well just be on a little bit of a plateau on its recovery, but only future data will show for sure. So I'm going to move on to the counties of California. The severity graph for California is looking good. Not great, because again, we like to see all these numbers in their low teens or single digits, but we only have two severely hit counties right now: the Royal Couple, Kings, and Imperial. Every other county it's barely a warm spot. The very worst, and those two aren't that bad. They're 260, 325. Kind of bad, and they're recovering. They're headed downwards. All the rest of the hardest hit severities, which means all the rest of the severities, all the counties, other than those two, have a severity of 117 or less, which means they're barely warm, or not at all warm. Most of them are not warm. I think there are only three if we really zoom in here. Who is actually a warm spot? We've got Yuba County, which is warm but declining. Madera County, warm but declining. Butte County, warm but declining quickly. And Monterey is the only one who's remotely bad graph here. I guess Kings and Imperial are kind of bad in terms of their height, but declining. But only Monterey among these is not declining, is warm and not declining. Every other county of the worst hit ones in California is showing a downward trend in its severity. So that is good news. Nothing bad to see there. California keeps doing well. Now, if we look in daily cases per million, I don't have that graph that I like so much that shows only the hottest ones in daily cases per million. Why is that? That's strange. I think I'm missing a graph here, but I can do this. They're still sorted by worst, I think. So I'm going to zoom in again. Where's Alameda? No, these are sorted. Oh, that's too bad. I think I need to do something with my graphs. Somehow a graph has kind of disappeared from here, which is the one that shows the worst counties and daily cases per million. We can still see that Kings at 300 is a hot spot. Imperial is barely a hot spot. Everyone else is warm at worst. The other counties in terms of cases, the worst ones are Monterey, interestingly, still hanging in there. In daily cases, it's actually a daily cases warm spot, though at least it's broadly declining in the longer term. Madera, Stanislaus, Tulare, San Benito, Sutter, Merced, Yuba, Sonoma, Kern. That's most of them. I may have skipped one in there. Who's this? San Bernardino. So the rest of the counties are daily cases. They're cool. They're not warm. However, none of them are in that range that we really want to get into, in the teens or single digits. But there's a real sense that everything's declining here. And you can see that the really bad wave we had is certainly over. There are a couple stragglers up here, but the big picture, I think, is just of the decline of daily cases across the state. Almost every line we see here seems to be angled downward. So that's almost every line we see here seems to be angled downward. So that's very good news for California. It's not there yet. None of these are far enough down, but they're all headed in the right direction. And finally, I think, because I am running out of time, this is to be expected from what we just said, but if we look at maybe this is kind of the graph I was talking about, the hottest counties, and what's their growth rates. This is great, really. We had that spike there that was due to a data anomaly back in August, computer problem. But and there was that thing where Butte, actually, who was it? Someone went wacko. I think it was Wine Country. No, I can't remember, but there was one that was off the charts briefly. That seems to have completely disappeared, whichever county that was. Marin. Maybe not. Marin? Yeah, you can see Marin. Marin is just completely, I have no idea what to make of Marin right now. Something weird happened there, but now it's claiming to have a 80% daily shrinkage, which is probably just as untrue as when it claimed to have a 300% daily rise. Anyway, looking at the top 20, these are the worst counties in hotness. All of them, except two, are below zero. They're all shrinking. Many of them are shrinking by quite a lot. And the two that are, San Diego and Imperial, that are above zero, are trending. They're very low, like 3% per week is just nothing. And they're also trending downward. The only thing that's remotely bad here is Lake, which seems at the moment to have just crossed zero, headed upwards, but I'm just not going to worry about that now. It's still at zero. It has this cyclic pattern anyway for whatever reason. And so maybe Lake will become a problem, but no one else is. We'll look at Santa Cruz briefly here, just because I know that I have some viewers there. Santa Cruz right now has had a wild ride, but right now Santa Cruz is shrinking 10% a day, and it's been holding that way for some time. Had a blip there, but before that it was shrinking as well. Santa Cruz is looking pretty good. Monterey is not looking bad either. Monterey's kind of seemed like one of the worst of the counties, and it certainly had a long period of growth. But lately the trend is towards shrinkage, and it's shrinking 20% or so, 10-20% a day, a week. I mean, if I said this was now 10% a day, that's not right. Santa Cruz is shrinking at about 10% a week. Same with Monterey. Let's just pull in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, because it's always fun to see that locality. It's just everything is good news. There's just no bad news here. Look at all those. The Bay Area, which also had a very wild ride in July, it's just shrinking. Steadily over this time. The growth rate's been dropping consistently since then and has now crossed zero and is staying below zero, and everything is looking good for the Bay Area counties. Now that said, I don't want to go too far into happy joy here. So let's take a look at the actual numbers, not the growth rates of the Bay Area. Monterey, San Francisco, San Benito, not San Benito. I sometimes throw in San Joaquin just for fun. Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, most of them. I think even Stanislaus kind of belongs there. Okay, I probably missed, at least missed San Mateo. May have missed another one, but here are some of the Bay Area and close to Bay Area counties. I'm going to take out San Joaquin and Stanislaus. Those are not really Bay Area. If you look at this, we see Monterey is the worst, and it's not hot anymore, but it's at 160. But though it's clearly and obviously dropping in cases. It used to be at 300, and now it's below. It's half that, or around half that. It's clearly dropped and gotten a lot better. It's still in a pretty bad place at 150 daily cases per million. The rest of the Bay Area is clustered around 50 now. So they've dropped from above 100 to about 50, which is a pretty good place. This is really a pretty good place, but it's no time to relax. They're not warm spots anymore, certainly not hot spots, but at 50, we'd still like to see them drop by, I don't know, factor of 5. Can we get them below 10? And so we'll see in the coming weeks whether this very nice downward trend of the counties of California persists. If it does at this rate, we will see these drop into down to 40, 30, 20, 10, and that would be great. And then we could actually start to maybe resume something like a normal life with the precautions of testing and contact tracing, and probably still masking for a while. But anyway, the news is very good for California compared to how it's been. And really it's very good for California compared to the United States and compared to the world right now. So whatever you're doing, Californians, keep doing it. You're going in the right direction. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for listening and watching.